we pause to acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and the Muwekwa Ohlone people. We trace our ancestry through the Mission Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all the Ohlone people, past and present. So we'd like to thank everyone again for coming tonight. Our event tonight, Reimagining Creation, an Interreligious Dialogue on Ecological and Social Justice, offers us a moment to reflect on our drive to create a more just, humane, and sustainable world. And is the second half of a two-part series, thinking about our relationship to creation. Before we start, I'd briefly like to frame, technical issue. I'd briefly like to frame some ideas behind this series and the relationship to the Bannon Forum's call to explore what it means to be a Jesuit university in this time and place. And what I'd like to do that is to focus on the idea of dialogue as part of the mission of this institution. And this dialogue is a vision of dialogue aimed at finding new points of view, new areas of common ground, and new insights for the benefit of all. This is not a contest of ideas to see which idea wins out of the other over the other, but a generative process towards meaningful action. In the context of tonight, the dialogue is to get us past these overly reductionist views of the natural world and a view which puts humanity outside and or above creation and nature. And as part of that, we must also grapple with questions of race, gender, colonialism, as they're integrally related to the goals of environmental justice we might seek. In particular, interreligious or intercultural dialogue offers an opportunity to see the blind spots, limitations, and harms caused by the prevailing modes of thought and culture. And for some of us like myself, that includes a better understanding about how my own culture or how our culture has fostered barriers and harm within it. And so in order to seek solutions to our questions around justice of all sorts, and in our context tonight, environmental justice, we're often in need of more inclusive and deeper ways of thinking. And so at its best, this vision of dialogue offers a chance for self-analysis and reflection that leads to meaningful action. And this movement from experience to reflection and action are at the heart of the Jesuit mission of Santa Clara University. And this pluralistic forum allows us to better know and engage reality through diverse experiences, diverse ways of knowing, and intellectual or spiritual tradition, with the hope that this way of proceeding will generate opportunities to transform the world into a more just, humane, and sustainable place. And so I look forward to tonight's conversation and hope it will be as rich as last week's conversation. If you weren't able to join us last week, which was a kind of conversation around agrarianism and creation, it will be up on our YouTube page soon, and you'll be able to view it there. But now I'd like to hand it over to Paul Schutz, who was really integral in helping me develop this two-part series. And Paul is assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies here at Santa Clara, and also the interim associate director of the graduate program in pastoral ministries. His research focuses on the relationship between religion and ecology, with an emphasis on how contemporary scientific knowledge grounds and informs humanity's relationship with the natural world and other than non-human creatures, sorry. A longtime liturgist and musician, his work also addresses the potential of Christian worship and biblical accounts of creation, life, and love, for cultivating a robust practice of ecological and social justice. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Paul to start.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you to everybody for being here with us tonight. It's a delight and a real pleasure to have you with us virtually here as we have this conversation, as Aaron said, the second part in our series. We have 4 terrific panelists with us today, and we're delighted to hear from them, and we will begin to in just a moment. I just wanted to give everybody a quick overview of what to expect as our conversation unfolds tonight. So we've invited each panelist to give a brief introduction to the tradition or traditions in which they have experience and expertise to set a groundwork for the conversation that we want to have as the evening proceeds. And after each of these introductions, I'll introduce each presenter before they speak. After these introductions, we'll open it up to a conversation among the presenters and a conversation with you all as our audience. And during that portion, we invite you to use the Q&A function or the chat to chat in questions to the panelists, and we will review those and call them and ask them to our four distinguished panelists, who will then discuss them as the evening goes on. So at any point in the first portion of our event tonight, feel free to start sending in questions, and we will get to those as the conversation goes on. But with that said, I would love to introduce to you now our first presenter, our first panelist, who is Professor Daniel Morgan, here, a member of our religious studies faculty, a new member, first year, the Zoom year of being on the religious studies faculty here in our department. It's great to have Daniel as a new colleague. Daniel comes to us most recently from the University of Chicago, where he finished up his PhD studying Islam, and in particular Sufism in South Asia, in the South Asian context, especially during the period of transition between the Mughal Empire and the colonial period of the British colonization of India. And so Daniel will speak from that perspective, bringing in elements of his research and work, and will be our first presenter tonight. So Daniel, thank you for being with us, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Paul. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much, Paul, and for the opportunity to speak this evening. It really is very nice to be here with you all. So I'm going to begin this evening with a story about a gazelle. And the story goes something like this. There was once a young prince who spent all his time hunting. And one day he goes out on the hunt and he encounters a female gazelle with her fawn. He chases them, and the older gazelle is able to escape. She's fast enough to get away. The fawn is not quite as fast, and it's trapped and it's caught in the hunter's snares. But although it's escaped, the mother, burning with the force of love, with mahabbat, tries to save its child. She comes back to the site of this hunt because of the sort of extremity of the emotion that is being experienced. She's not afraid of the danger that she herself faces. So the hunter sees this, and the love of the gazelle has an effect on him, on his heart, and he releases the fawn from his trap. The gazelle makes a supplication to God on behalf of the hunter, and we're told that immediately a voice speaks to the hunter saying, "Oh, you who comfort the heart of my creation, as a blessing for your act of compassion, we will grant you the position of ruler." And shortly thereafter, this man becomes the emperor. So I want you to kind of hold on to this story, have it in your minds, as I briefly turn to a slightly more abstract discussion about creation and metaphysics, and the relationship between God and creation as viewed from within the sort of Islamic tradition, as far as I've experienced it through my work as a historian. So historically, one of the most productive questions in Islam, in theology, philosophy, mysticism, even poetry, has been the tension between God's absolute, undelimited oneness. This is central to the Islamic message, God's oneness, and the plurality of the created world. How did this plurality and multiplicity that we see around us, and the Quran is very explicit that the variety of people, the variety of languages, these are signs of God. These are God's ayat. So how does this multiplicity emerge from a single unitary source? So one of the many, and we should stress many, there are many answers that the Islamic tradition has provided to this question, but one of them was to argue that the diversity of variegated entities in the world are ultimately reducible to a single reality or existence. In Arabic, the word is wujud. So in this view, existence, wujud, is not in fact separate from God at all. Rather, existence is an ongoing and ever-changing manifestation of the divine essence as it turns towards creation. So sometimes the relationship between the divine essence and creation is conceptualized as being like a relationship between water and bubbles. So each bubble is kind of contained within the water, and they appear to be distinct entities, but ultimately there's only water. The bubbles are nothing more than kind of small delimited forms or manifestations of that water, completely dependent on the water. And as the kind of waves crash, the bubbles disappear. And that's kind of how we might think about creation. Another way of thinking of it that this tradition offers us is that the relationship between a dream and the dreamer, right? So the dream is completely dependent on the person having the dream, but at the same time, it's not distinct from it. If there's no person, then there is no dream, but they're not identical. if we look at the dream, it's not the same as the person having the dream. So we see this kind of ontological continuity, but not sheer identity between God and the world. So for those who take this view, primarily Sufis within the kind of broader tradition of the famous Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi, great emphasis was placed on a hadith, a canonical saying of the Prophet Muhammad that describes his experience of the breath of the All-Merciful, Nafas al-Rahman. In this tradition, this breath of the All-Merciful that the Prophet experienced is taken to be the kind of divine essence as it turns towards creation, the breath of mercy emanating from it, giving existence to the eternal objects of its knowledge. So in short, everything we see around us is the literal manifestation of divine mercy, this ongoing act of divine exhalation, recreated in each moment and continuing only through God's mercy. So mercy is not kind of an emotion here, it's the act of creation itself. So in this tradition, basically this doctrine comes to be known as the oneness of being, Wahdatul Wujud. And it was one of the best known and most controversial theological ideas in the kind of pre-colonial Islamic world. And one of the main reasons that this is controversial is it has the effect of rendering all things true in the degree that they are manifestations of God. So for those who want to draw a very stark line between belief and unbelief, truth and falsity, this can be a slightly dangerous idea. So Ibn Arabi, for example, he discusses the story of Noah, in which the people of Noah refused to give up their worship of idols. And Ibn Arabi argues that had they rejected those idols, they would have been ignorant of God, the truth, in the measure that they rejected them. For in every in every object of worship, there is an aspect of God, which one who knows him knows, and one who does not know him does not know. So the point being here that wherever you turn to, whatever you worship, you're worshiping God. If you worship an image, you're worshiping God. If you worship God as an abstract, you're worshiping God. So he cites this Quranic verse, which goes like this: your Lord determined that you will not worship other than he. And so the commonsensical reading of that text is that you should worship God in the prescribed ways of Islam. Ibn Arabi takes it in another sense, that your Lord determined that you will not worship other than he means that you cannot worship other than he. Whatever you worship, you are worshiping him. It's a counterintuitive reading, but it informs much of Ibn Arabi's metaphysics. So what does this have to do with politics, with the social world? For Muslim rulers in the pre-colonial period, Wahdatul Wujud deeply inflects the politics of many Islamic dynasties, especially in South Asia. So in these territories, Muslim rulers are trying to integrate a diverse range of peoples from different religious and linguistic backgrounds, different sectarian backgrounds within Islam itself. And so Wahdatul Wujud, the oneness of being, offers this way of accommodating radical difference. And it's far more fluid than the kind of distinctions that Islamic law, that fiqh kind of offers for regulating difference. In as far as every religious path contains some truth, it can be kind of accommodated within this broader imperial framework. And so the Mughals have this policy called Sulh-i-Kull, peace with all, and a political structure that includes individuals from all religious, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds. So with this in mind, I want to come back to the gazelle that we left at the beginning of the talk. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that story was also written by a South Asian Sufi, a firm adherent of the concept of the oneness of being. An essential message that I take from his parable is that all creation, human and non-human, is infused with this outflowing of divine mercy. And here that's understood in its most literal sense. The hunter attains divine favor only after he recognizes that he, like the deer, is a locus for this divine mercy, which, as we saw, was this act of creation. So I wanted to share this story with you, just to suggest that these Sufi conceptions of creation give space to fairly radical ideas about human plurality, but also they expand and broaden our perhaps common sense idea of who worships God, and who, by extension, can lay claim to a share in divine compassion and justice. And I'd like to suggest that these traditions offer a way of revisiting our often quite modern conceptions of the hard boundaries between different religious groups, but also between people and animals, or rather between human animals and non-human animals. And they show that, in terms which are quite distinct from kind of modern contemporary mainstream ecological discourse, that social, political, and environmental justice are all interconnected. If I may, I'm just going to briefly end with the words of a Pakistani anthropologist, Nosheen Ali, whose work sort of challenges the desacralized cosmos of Western science, or Western scientism, as she calls it. As she writes, the perspectives of the non-Western majority are relegated to some ancient primordial past, classified as either indigenous, unscientific, or impractical, while the believers of human supremacy are assumed to be universal, neutral, rational, and faith-free. Ali goes on to argue that contemporary research on ecology routinely assumes that the whole world is anthropocentric, denying that for the most part, the majority of the world continues to inhabit a markedly different ethos of nature and the place of humans within it, than the Euro-Western we that is assumed to be the norm in academic thought and theory. And she finishes by arguing that ecology in Muslim thought and practice, as well as in South Asia more broadly, is an evidently sacred concept instead of an anthropocentric one. And so I will end there with the words of Nosheen Ali. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for that excellent presentation. It's going to be the seedbed in dialogue with our other presenters for so much good stuff. Thank you so much. Our second presenter this evening, panelist to speak, will be Andy Galvin, who is the president of the board of the Ohlone Nation, or the indigenous community, the Indian community, this local.
Use Indian.
Indian, yes, yeah, area. I caught that in your email earlier today as well. That's great. And Andy, just before, was telling us that he traces his roots all the way back to the earliest phases of the European invasion, and has done work historically, works as a museum curator as well, doing historical work around the history of the Ohlone community here in the Bay Area. And will be speaking to us from that perspective tonight. In tracing his history back, he traces it all the way back to the pre-contact roots that stretch back into the history of the Ohlone people, who, as Aaron said in the land acknowledgement, are the true and original inhabitants of this land that our university now stands upon today. So, Andy, thank you so much for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be part of this presentation. I do have some prepared comments, but just to dovetail on what was earlier said, is very important for Native peoples, but is very important for any religious group, storytelling. Because when we tell a story, we invite other people into our story. If most of us, I think, especially at the Jesuit institution, know the Christian story. And the greatest Christian stories take place at those magic moments with the Jesus character. And one of the greatest storytelling events in the Gospels is on the road to Emmaus. Later that evening, Easter Sunday, he's walking along the road with two disciples, but they didn't know him. And until he opened their minds and explained all the scriptures to him, did their eyes opened and they realized who they were with. I think every single one of our religious traditions has stories that are told that invite others into our tradition. And in the Native tradition that I'd like to present, and since I've been asked to keep it brief, I've prepared some comments because otherwise I'd be here until tomorrow morning. But I think during this dialogue, I will attempt to examine Native spirituality. And one of the difficulties that must be considered is the difference between Western and Native spirituality. In most of Western thought, a distinction is made between the sacred and the profane. It is possible to encounter individuals and church communities who distinguished between their secular and their spiritual lives. Indeed, even at the level of language, Europeans have different words for spirituality and for religion. Most Native American languages, however, lack such words. This absence of such words is a result of the Native religious experience. And so for Native people, religion is pervasively present and is in complex interrelationships with all aspects of people's lifeways. Another equally important difficulty is the tendency of placing all Native American thought into one category. There is neither one Native American tradition nor one spiritual legacy. Instead, there is vast polarity and diversity. The past several years have seen a great increase in interest in Native spirituality. This is a welcome change after decades of decline in the practice of Native American cultures. The relationship of Native spirituality to the universe is foundational. Among Native peoples, the experience of relationship is critical. We exist in relationship to one another, to the other living creatures, to the whole created order. We are called to keep these relationships in harmony. Native spirituality relates one both to the world of visible creation and to the world of spirits. It forms in us a personal relationship to the earth so that we treat her with respect and reverence. It is a centering of ourselves in creation through a relationship to the four directions, the foundations of the universe and the place where spirits dwell. Through this spirituality, we learn to live in harmony with all creatures. It also puts us at ease with the spirits through accepting their presence and through the offerings of spiritual food. Such an attitude is continually reenacted in the prayer in the four directions. In this prayer, the individual or group prepares for the sacred by placing themselves in appropriate relationship with creation. Some sacred symbols in the Native American world, which express and give meaning and relevance in the lives of people, will be experienced through such prayer. The sacred circle, brother sun, mother earth, the medicine wheel, and sacred drum are for Native peoples signs of fullness, unity, and good health. The gifts of creation and family members are referred to as brother sun, mother earth, each giving us life. The sacred objects of the circle, the medicine wheel with its four directions or winds, and the drum with its rhythmic beat in tune with our own heart beat, are all the sources of strength, wholeness, unity, and harmony. There's a story that I like briefly to share here about the experience of a relationship to creation. We know in many ways the culture of my ancestors here in the San Francisco Bay region is described as a hunter and gatherer culture. We did manage the environment too, even though some people don't like to acknowledge that. But we hunted and we gathered. And the story is that there was a man in community who was one of the greatest hunters in the village. And at this time, when the right season was to hunt down the deer to provide food for the village and the family, his wife was near her time of delivery of a child. And so he went to the neighbor, who was not such a good hunter as himself, and asked the neighbor, would you go on the hunt and would you successfully kill a deer or two to bring home for my family, as I can't go on the hunt? And he stated the reason he couldn't go on the hunt, because at that time, as he was about to receive life from the Creator, the child that was about to be born, it was not correct for him to take a life. So there's a balance and understanding in creation. And I think that's one thing Native spirituality teaches us. And I know as we talk about the various traditions and we think of the various forms of worship, somehow along the line, when people think Native Americans, as I say, I'm an Indian, when they think about Indians, they often think about dancing. And I'll talk about that as we progress. But dancing is great worship. And I think if there are any liturgists in the crowd, I remember one thing I learned from one of my liturgy professors. Good liturgy is good theater, and it attracts and feeds with all the senses, a smell, of taste, of sound, and vision. And that's how we do when we worship, particularly outdoors with no walls to mask all of God's creation, as we turn to those four directions and greet creation in each direction.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that beautiful, beautiful introduction. And that concluding reflection is just so powerful. And I look forward to see how it takes us into our conversation as we go forward. Thank you.
You're welcome.
To everyone that's out there in the audience with us tonight, we invite you again as the conversation unfolds. If any questions come to mind, if there's anything you'd like to discuss at any point, send them in using either the Q&A function or the chat. Our third panelist tonight is Professor Ruben Habito of the Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. It's just endured that weather we were all witnessing from afar, that was striking Texas, and is in many ways relevant to our conversation tonight. Ruben came to the Perkins School at SMU after spending a great deal of time in Japan, wherein he was living and working, studying Zen Buddhism, medieval Buddhism, and the Buddhist tradition more broadly. And he comes to us speaking from that perspective today. In particular, I just wanted to lift up that how delighted I am to have you with us, Ruben, tonight, because just on Monday, I taught an article of yours to one of my classes. Some of my students are here tonight. The Mountains, Rivers, and the Great Earth from the Yale volume on religion and ecology. It's been a staple in my classes. And so there's a delightful sort of personal connection there to you and your work that really just makes me very happy to have you with us. So I'm going to pass it over to Ruben, who will speak now on Buddhism.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you. I'm really honored and grateful at this invitation to share some perspectives on this panel, which I consider a very vital topic for all of us, on how we as human beings can really live in a way that can heal our severely wounded earth together from all of our different perspectives. And this is a kind of panel that we need to have more and more of. First, also, I would like to express my deep gratitude and how I was deeply moved by Aaron's opening when you acknowledged the first peoples of the land, the keepers of the land, who were the ones who tended the land in which the university that you are located in continues now to operate and be a gift to the people. I heard that kind of acknowledgement first when I went to Australia for a World Parliament of Religions gathering. There were about 10,000 people who gathered from all the different continents, and we all went to Melbourne for about a week in 2012. And every plenary session began with that kind of acknowledgement of the first peoples of the land, and especially in the light of the current way in which the peoples who really kept the land before the others came are now being discriminated upon and are really being treated as second-class citizens. That pain is brought up, and at least there is some sense that there's a need for that kind of amelioration and that kind of repentance. And as after I came back to this country where I'm located in Dallas, I was born in the Philippines, by the way, and spent about 20 years in Japan before coming here. I began to see this country, the United States, and with different eyes from my experience of having seen and having heard the voices of the peoples there in Australia. I knew about it intellectually, but having heard that acknowledgement, and I really appreciated the way we began this this panel with that acknowledgement. And I hope that that is a point of view, an attitude, a sense of reverence that we can all keep. And I'm so glad to be in the same panel with Andy, from whom I look forward to learning a lot, much more from here. And you'll expect emails from me from here on, Andy, with a lot of questions and requests for material. But I am here to speak from a Buddhist perspective. I first encountered Buddhism when I went to Japan. I was sent to Japan as a Jesuit seminarian, scholastic, as we call it in our Jesuit language, preparing for ordination to the priesthood. So from a predominantly Catholic country, I was sent to Japan, where Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, number less than 1% of the population. And I was sent at a time, 1970, when the church as a whole, the Catholic Church, was bubbling with enthusiasm for implementing the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. So my assignment was, in addition to preparing myself for ordination through theology courses, was also to study in a more detailed and more professional way about Buddhism and Japanese religions, so that I would be able to help the Catholic Church and the Christian community dialogue with, learn from, and interact with, and cooperatively work with Japanese religions and spiritualities in our common endeavor. So with that, then I received many treasures from Japan. But to make a long story short, I then also learned about Buddhist practice. That's where I also learned a way of sitting in Zen meditation, which for me, having been raised as a Jesuit for at that point a number of years, and I spent a total of 25 years as a Jesuit. The spiritual exercises for me was a very basic source of nourishment for being in touch with that spiritual realm, that enables us to open to the holy and to be open to one another. And now encountering Zen, well, again, backtracking, the spiritual exercises, it's a very methodical approach. Now I am introduced to Zen, and the main thing I am taught is to sit still, breathe with awareness, and just let my mind be at rest in the here and now. So with that mode of practice, I continued to learn more and more about my own Christian tradition and began to see riches within that tradition in the way it was dialoguing with Buddhism. And so that is a continuing endeavor of mine. So out of that background, one of the passions that came to me was that when I visited my country, the Philippines, already based in Japan, I saw so many things that were happening that were very, not only disconcerting, but were really heartbreaking. I visited Mindanao, one of the second biggest islands in the Philippines, and I saw whole forests being ravaged by these loggers, and they were just bringing the log back to the city and being exported to industrialized countries for use there at the expense of the peoples who were living there. So the pain of the earth somehow came to me in a very, very direct way in visiting my own country. So with that, my increased interest in how our religious understanding and our religious experience and our religious practice can address this very gaping wound of our earth community together, and not just see it as one of those things that are optional as to leading a religious life. So with that, I came to ask, how can Buddhism, or how does Buddhism address our ecological situation? So the theme of ecology and Buddhism has been something that I have been also working on, in addition to my other tasks in comparative theology. But as a summary, I only have a few more minutes. I'd like to just focus on the Zen tradition, because if we look at Buddhism, there are Buddhisms and there are Buddhisms. And if we look at the history, there are many complicated ramifications. So rather than trying to summarize them all, I'll focus on one tradition, which I'm most familiar with, that is Zen. But before that, let me also mention that in early Buddhism, there was a distinction between living beings who were taught and understood to have, to be endowed with Buddha nature, and the so-called environment, the bhajana, the receptacle in which or within which living beings continue their lifespans and so on. So there was a distinction already between sattva, living beings, and the bhajana, environment. And so the environment was something exterior to living beings. That was in Indian Buddhism. But then as Buddhism was transported and transmitted and became part of Chinese culture and influenced Chinese culture, and then also Japanese and Korean, that notion of separation between the living beings and the receptacle somehow became thinner and thinner, and gradually nature, like not just the animals who are the ones who are subject to the flow of life, so-called reincarnation, birth and rebirth in the Hindu tradition, which Buddhism took over, as opposed to plants who were not part of that circle. In China, they became also part of the circle of living beings. And later on, it was not just the plants as such, but even all beings are now considered as part of that community of sentient beings that are also endowed with Buddha nature. Anyway, that's another whole development of a concept that needs to be traced with Jew documentation. But to make us, just to summarize, in East Asian Buddhism, and especially in Zen Buddhism, there is no longer any separation between so-called living beings as such and things like stones or rocks or mountains and rivers and so on. Mountains and rivers are all part of that circle of living beings, of sentient beings that are endowed with Buddha nature. Now, intellectually, we don't need to discuss that as to how it went, but just to take that as a starting point, I would like to offer not a story, but two little sayings, two verses, which can be a mental image that will help us enter into the world that Zen Buddhism offers in addressing our ecological situation. One of them comes from a 13th century Zen master whose name is Dogen, very familiar with many Westerners. There are many books about him. But Dogen, Zen Master Dogen, in his very influential, voluminous collection of Zen talks called Shobo Genzo, or the Treasury of the Eye of True Dharma, has many different segments with different aspects of the Zen worldview. And just lifting up one of those, in one of those chapters, there's a saying that I have found very powerful, which is also the statement or the verse that triggered the awakening experience of my own Zen master, Yamada Koun Roshi, whom I met and owe a lot in Kamakura, Japan. I practiced Zen with him, and I bear and I continue to uphold his Dharma. My teacher was riding a train back from his workplace in Tokyo to his town in Kamakura, commuting daily. And on one such evening, he was reading a book of Dogen with his wife beside him, and he came upon that very passage. I came to realize that mind is no other than mountains and rivers, the great wide earth, the sun, the moon, the stars. I repeat the passage. I came to realize clearly that mind is no other than mountains, rivers, the great wide earth, the sun, the moon, the stars. And Yamada Koun, my teacher, describes how in reading that passage, something opened up to him and he began to laugh out loud, and he just broke himself into a big guffaw of laughter, realizing something important. But his wife told him, "We're in a public place, so please be quiet, behave yourself." So he had to restrain that until they got home, and later that night it came again in a big, big explosion of laughter, saying, now I've realized it. The Buddhas have not deluded me. And that is what I'd like to offer here, first of all. That realization that Zen practice invites us to, this practice of just sitting still, allowing our mind to be quiet and open, and allowing our heart to really embrace what is, can open our realization, open us to that realization that mountains, rivers, the great wide earth are not separate from who I am. And in doing so, in realizing that, whenever there's a tree that is felled thoughtlessly, I feel the searing of that pain of that tree. And that is the most natural thing. Today, I live in Dallas, and I live in a little community or a little group where there are new houses that are being built because people who have lived here for a time sell their houses. And when a new, rather than a buyer who wants to live in the house, a contractor or a builder buys those houses and then builds a house that is twice as large and so on. And what they do is cut the trees that had been on the lawns of those houses. And it is so painful to live in such a context where we hear those searing sounds of the saws on our, so near us. And that is what this Zen vision can offer us, that we are not separate from the mountains and rivers and the big wide earth. And precisely because of that non-separation, then the earth's pain is ours, and so we cannot but give ourselves to helping in the healing of earth. There's one more passage, but I will forego that because I think I've overused my time. But thank you.
Not at all. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you, Ruben, for setting up the Zen tradition in that way. And that shift of perspective, I think, that you're describing is something that's going to be really central to our conversation as it goes forward. So thank you for centering that as we go on with our conversation. Our final panelist this evening, is Professor Kathleen Chopra McGowan, another newly acquired member of our religious studies faculty here at Santa Clara University. It's a delight to have you with us, as I said when I was introducing Daniel, for this odd Zoom year that we have had, with everything being remote. And we really look forward to, all of the great years we'll have ahead once we're really back together. Professor Chopra McGowan comes to us with expertise in biblical literature, in particular the Hebrew Bible, in its ancient Near Eastern context. So bridging multiple disciplines, literary studies, history, biblical studies, especially with attention to literary depictions in the Bible of military defeat and lament and many other categories that surround that. And so it's great to have you with us, Kathleen, and we invite you now to offer your introduction.
Thank you so much, Paul, for your introduction. And thank you both to Paul and to Aaron for inviting me to join this panel this evening. As Paul just mentioned, I study the Hebrew Bible with a focus on the ancient Near Eastern setting. And I also have training in literary and political afterlives of ancient Indian epics. So what I'm going to talk about today is going to end up drawing on both of these traditions. From Hinduism to Judaism and Christianity. And as I thought about what I was going to say at this forum, I found myself repeatedly returning to the idea of water. This is in part because of two catastrophes that we've seen in the last month. The first on February 7th of the bursting of a dam in North India and a subsequent flood. This was in the Himalayan mountains. And the second about a week later, starting around the 14th of February, and of which Ruben probably has the most immediate experience, of an unprecedented snowstorm that hit Texas. On the surface, perhaps a Texan snowstorm, a glacier bursting a dam in the Indian Himalayas, those might have very little in common, and even less to do with my area of expertise, the Bible. But stay with me while I tell you about how I'm seeing the connections here. Let me start with the broad contours of the creation stories in the book of Genesis. In the priestly creation account in Genesis 1, the narrator begins the story with water. We're told that at the very beginning of the world's creation, Earth was basically just a watery mess. During these early days, God separates the shapeless, watery mishmash into waters that are above the heavens and below the earth, and he does this with the help of dry land and the sky in between. It's to contain the waters in their respective locations. And in the second creation story, in the Yahwistic version, the focus is a bit less cosmic, it's more local, but water plays a starring role once again. It's the mist that allows the water to sprout plants, and it's the rivers that sustain the emerging vegetation that provide water to the first humans. But in both accounts, the act of creation is one of control. It's one of delimiting boundaries and establishing order. God wrestles the natural world into position, and in that, humans emerge atop animals, at least according to the first account. But nature somehow stands a little bit separate from human control. Both stories in Genesis participate in a well-established ancient Near Eastern trope in which kings demonstrate their power and their right to rule through the establishment of order in the natural and built environments. A good king needs to be able to tame the world around him through the subduing of wild animals and the creation of exotic gardens so that his kingdom thrives. The control then by which Yahweh brings about order in the world is understood as necessary for the flourishing of creation, and it's a strong expression of his act of divine kingship. And under Yahweh's rule, under his divine kingship, humans are given laws by which they're to live, to preserve the order that God brings about. But what happens if humans break these rules? Well, I can tell you right now, nothing good happens. Recall that when I just mentioned the first creation account, humans are given dominion over animals, but never over natural resources. The natural world is a somewhat threatening place. It's filled with its own agency. And in the Bible, we see God portrayed repeatedly as drawing on this agency by allowing the land to partake in its own purification, in its own sanctification. In Leviticus, for example, the land literally vomits out people if the sins become too numerous, dirtying the land. The land just cannot tolerate it. It spits out the people. In Hosea, the land is called to be a witness on behalf of God when he's acting as a prosecutor with a lawsuit against the people. The wild power of water in the story of Noah cleanses the world of violence. Put simply, the actions of human beings prompt a response from the world around them. Land and animals can cry out to God just as human beings can. Humanity is never apart from the world in which it lives. Now, I've been thinking about this quality of being an agent in the natural world as I think about that dam in India flooding and the snowstorm in Texas. In India, there's this long-standing and ongoing battle between environmentalists and developers and the government over whether or not to build large dams at various points along the sacred Ganges River. Environmentalists argue that to interfere with the fragile ecosystem of the river and the mountains through which it flows can only end in disaster. Religious Hindus argue that damming the river threatens to desacralize their goddess Ganges, and it will result in her visiting wrath upon people. Now, the predictions of both came to pass a couple of weeks ago when a glacier melted due to warming global temperatures and caused the dam to which that glacier's water flowed to break. Nearly 200 people were killed in the torrent of water that flooded everything in its path. And in Texas, the seemingly unthinkable happened as the state experienced this large snowstorm, the collapse of its electrical system, the failure of the state to provide water and food for its people. In both Texas and Uttarakhand, water burst every boundary that humans placed on it. Through snow on the ground, in overflowing pipes that froze, in flooding that followed the remains of the dam. The poet Wendell Berry once wrote that whether we and our politicians know it or not, nature is party to all of our deals and our decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. I love this quote. It illustrates so well what those biblical texts that I referenced were also saying. Our efforts at constantly taming the natural world meet resistance when they are done without attention to their long-term effects. Reading stories like the Genesis creation accounts or stories about the Ganga and how she visits wrath upon the people prompt us to revisit how we engage and live in our ecosystems. Land and water, despite what we might think, how we might act, have never been under our dominion. And now they're demanding justice and rest from our incessant attempts to tame them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that awesome introduction. I love, who would have thought that, relating the Ganga and the Himalaya to Texas would, be so fruitful. But in this moment, and in light of the reality of climate change, that's such a beautiful illustration, and the way that you connected that to the Hebrew Bible, to those well-known creation stories in such a unique way, I think will be really great and fruitful for the conversation to follow. So we're going to begin to transition now toward that conversation among our panelists. And once again, we invite anybody who's out there with a question or something that you would, maybe a topic that you'd love to hear from the panelists about, from the various perspectives that have been articulated already. Feel free to send those in, and we will work them into the conversation as it unfolds. I want to throw out one idea to everybody just to get us started, because I think in some ways, differences sort of theologically and philosophically notwithstanding, and they're significant, okay, but just to say that, these differences notwithstanding, and noting that, this being a function, this being an event of the Ignatian Center, the legacy of the Jesuit tradition has this famous phrase, finding God in all things. And I think that, that phrase becomes a buzzword. Sometimes it becomes kind of like a slogan, for Jesuit institutions. But I think in light of what all of you have said, Daniel, I'm thinking of the example of the bubbles in the water, Andy, praying in the four directions, the idea of, non-separability in the Buddhist, all these kinds of things, the idea that somehow there is this unity to things that, at least in the Christian Ignatian articulation of the tradition, comes through in that phrase, finding God in all things. I wonder, thinking from your various perspectives, how that phrase, as you understand it, coming from the Ignatian tradition, resonates in the way, with the way that we imagine humanity's role and responsibility. Kind of, Kathleen, as you were talking about, what would it mean to take an idea like that seriously and to live according to it, in a way that sort of reverences nature or sees humanity as one with nature? What kind of things might that bring up? What might it challenge? What might it invite? Just throw that out there, with a good sort of Jesuit university, tagline, to get us started, and open it up to you all to discuss freely as you wish, and we'll go from there.
I'd like to take a shot at that first. As is known generally, Buddhism is a non-theistic tradition. Well, in a qualified way, because there are some Buddhist developments that have a conceptual framework that regards a savior, and namely the Pure Land Buddhism. But we'll just put that in brackets now. But overall, Buddhism is said to be a non-theistic religion. So the word God would not figure within a worldview of what Buddhists would understand as what reality is all about. But In that regard, as a Christian, Catholic Christian, continuing to struggle with how I may live my faith in the context of what I've learned from Buddhism, I have learned that there are ways in which the term God can be a very idolatrous concept, but there are ways of overcoming that in a way that we can return God to what those who have experienced God in their lives have expressed. And I take cue from St. Augustine, who said, "You are more intimate to me than I am to myself, and higher than my highest peak, bigger than everything I can ever imagine, and yet more intimate to me than I am to myself." So with that, I am very hesitant to use the word God because it puts that term as a kind of an objective reality out there. So when I say from my Jesuit tradition, finding God in all things, I understand that as finding the holy in all things and finding the interconnectedness, finding a source of respect and awe in all things. And as the Second Vatican Council's document Nostra Aetate had given us a hint, all that is good and true and holy is not rejected at all by Catholics, by Christians, but ascribe them to the same source, whom we name as God, the God of the triune mystery in our tradition. So in that regard, what is holy, what is true and good, what is calling for reverence is what I find in mountains and rivers, the great wide earth, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And it is that attitude that I hope we can all nurture, each from our own religious perspectives in our own cultural contexts.
Any of the other panelists wish to reflect on that idea? Finding God in all things, how it relates?
Perhaps I might offer some thoughts.
Please.
I know we're talking about the University of Santa Clara as a Jesuitical institution, but when my ancestors encountered religion there, it was Franciscanism. And, you know, we have a great Pope right now, a Jesuit, but who took the name Francis. And people often will ask me, how is it that at all these missions, and we agree that it was colonialism, but yet there was the good goal of trying to work with the natives, especially on the part of the Franciscan friars. And at every mission, there comes a moment where something went right and the people come into the mission. And it's not necessarily that the padre learned the right words to say in his Sunday homilies, or that an understanding was happening, but basically it was because the natural environment was being destroyed by the Spanish animals, the cow, the goat, the pig, the horse. They were eating everything that was the natural grocery store. And so therefore the people who had refused to come into the mission, they looked at the mission, they saw the cattle, they saw the corn growing in the field. They choose to survive and they choose to come into the mission. They didn't really understand at that moment, most likely, that once you came in, you couldn't leave. But it was a choice they could make only once, and that was to move in, because then they were prohibited from leaving. But in many cases, as the time moves on through the Franciscan period and now into the Jesuit period, there are times religiously, spiritually, where something must have happened that the native people and the religious, the Franciscans, later the Jesuits, what was the common ground? Creation. And I look at it and I see in a lot of the older people in my family, many of them are now gone, but it was something that Francis himself in Rome hit upon 2 years ago. Creation. God's creation. There's something in Francis of Assisi and his connection to creation and to the native peoples of California and their relationship to creation. There's a common ground there with land, sea, animals, and the environment that the spirituality was able to match. Because at some point, we understand that it was very difficult for native peoples who were used of praying outside, where they could see the sun, where they could see the moon, where they could feel the wind in the air, and the smells of fire burning. And they're moved into a four-walled building and they can't see God because they can't see creation. And then we notice in a lot of the drawings of the early 19th century, 1814 and so on, visitors are drawing native peoples holding their dances in front of the mission buildings. Something must have been understood with the friars who were the spiritual leaders of Christianity, that the native peoples preferred to pray outside where they could see creation. And so there's this place where there's an understanding. And I see that happening even today as we move into the modern generation, to our own time, where in Catholic Christian worship, especially at those major life transitions of birth, marriage, and death, where the church is allowing native peoples to bring in the traditional customs to be practiced at those big three moments in the life of a person. And so there's an overlapping and an understanding, and it seems to be it's something that's even alive today. And yes, whether it's Jesuit or a Jesuit named Francis that's having the influence on us, but the native peoples who are the original caretakers of this property, and we're still trying to care for this area, that we are finding a way to understand what we still call a new religion.
That's great, Andy. Thank you. Thank you. And I love the way that you're drawing together those two traditions. And, throughout your comments tonight, you haven't shied away from the realities of abuse and the realities of damage and harm that were done throughout, the history of colonization and the theft of the lands of the indigenous peoples of the United States, and at the same time demonstrate this really wonderful appreciation for and even joy in sort of thinking with the way that the two traditions have found, as you said, common ground. I love that phrase, literally and both literally and metaphorically. That's what we're talking about, standing on the same ground together, and that image being so good. You got me thinking as you talked about Francis, and I'd love to hear from everybody or anybody that wants to respond on this. That in Laudato Si, the first big statement, from a Catholic perspective on the ecological crisis, we get this really strong critique of what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm, right? This paradigm that uses the tools of science, uses our investigation of the natural world ultimately as a tool for exploitation and control. And here I'm thinking, Kathleen, of many of the things you were talking about the damming of the rivers and the sort of theological and philosophical significance of that, as well as the sort of sociological significance of trying to sort of get nature under control. So, I think about a place like Silicon Valley, and I think about the Bay Area being, the mission history that Andy, you've just talking about. There is so much of this history of subduing and seeking control and seeking to, make creation in our image or what it is that we seek, rather than seeing whether it is the interconnectedness of all things, the God's presence within it, whatever it might be, however these traditions envision it. So I'm wondering, as you think about those things, what strategies for responding to things like the dominance of the technocratic paradigm or exploitative practices do you see emerging from the worldviews that we were discussing tonight? How do those worldviews offer something that is the basis for a response or a challenge, and a movement toward sort of a more holistic and ecologically beneficial view? Anybody want to think with that?
I'll take a stab at it. I like how you phrased it, and it goes really well actually with the question you just asked earlier too, of seeing God in all things. And how do you put something like that into conversation with, as you're calling it, the technocratic paradigm, right? And everything we've just said here. And I think I'm thinking again about what Wendell Berry would say, and he'd say, well, you need to revisit everything you're doing. You need to just upend how you're living life, and reframe what you're thinking as, what you're placing as the centers of importance. Those matters, as Paul Tillich would say, of ultimate concern. What are you locating them as? And I think that in a very sort of concrete way, in a practical way, we can't all completely change our lives, right? That's not always possible. But what these religious traditions that we've all been talking about today can do is that they give us new and unusual, maybe little used language to reframe some of the problems and to reframe the solutions. So if one particular approach isn't working, we can reframe it with another approach, right? And so when I think about the dams in India, the environmentalists there who are working on this project are looking at it not just from the scientific point of view of what happens when the fish no longer have the water to swim in. They're also looking at it from that religious perspective, from the perspective of this being a goddess, of this being sacred water. And they're saying, can we convince you that this is an important thing to think about if we phrase it in this way, right? If we phrase it in terms that matter to people. And I think this is what religion writ large offers us, is this way of seeing ourselves as embedded within the world that we live in. And so, yes, we have all of these like ways of separating ourselves, of limiting our contact with the natural world, right? We can be so distant from the problems that we are creating. And religion is saying, no, you're part of it. And it's going to affect you one way or another. So I think that's what one avenue, at least, that it has to offer us in.
May I? Thank you, Kathleen. I just wanted to call our attention to a question on the Q&A by Julia Claire Santos, which may take us to another area. But I'd like to answer from a Buddhist perspective, and I'd like to invite Andy also to respond in his own way. The question is, I'm curious about panelists' thought of cultural appropriation of some of the traditions you're sharing, and how that phenomenon might connect with a broad appeal of the natural world and or an embrace of non-dual thought. Well, briefly, there are many Buddhist communities here in North America, and many come to those Buddhist centers of practice from a specific religious background, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or their spiritual but not religious backgrounds and so on. But let's say someone who is coming from a Christian community says, oh, I want to learn meditation in a Buddhist community. And so they go there and find that's really something that they can truly appropriate. But if that's only used or taken as in a utilitarian way, that does not respect the Buddhist tradition, then somehow there seems to be something lacking there. So what I would like to suggest or recommend to such persons who are attracted by Buddhist tradition, who come from a Christian perspective, is to really be open to what the Buddhist practice can give to them. And in that connection, let that be a point in which they are able to re-examine their own understanding of the tradition. And the example of that, I'll just be brief, comes to that last point that Julia raised, embrace of non-dual thought. For example, traditionally Christianity is thought to be a dualistic religion with God as the transcendent, as one dimension of reality, and then there's the rest of us, creation, which is totally separate from God. And in one sense, that's true. We have to affirm that ultimate separation. But another sense, we also are called to realize that God is more intimate to us than we are to ourselves. That immanent dimension, which tends to be lost in conversations about reality and about God in Christian discourse. So there's a book by Cynthia Burgo called "The Heart of Centering Prayer Toward a Non-Dual Christianity." So those of us who have practiced and learned from the Buddhist tradition may begin to see that Christianity doesn't have to be a dualistic religion at all, but it has some of those non-dual aspects that can thereby transform Christianity itself towards something that is that it may have already had but was not emphasized. I'll stop at that, and I'd invite Andy to respond to this from his own perspective.
Am I unmuted? Yes. Okay. Thank you. The one thing I could address is the appropriation, because with us Native peoples, in many of us, we are either protecting the tradition that has been saved and handed down basically an oral tradition, or we are trying to retrieve it ourselves from the old folks who are passing away, or from documentation as to how the religion was practiced. We do this especially as our languages, the very languages that were suppressed at the California missions, are now being brought back alive. We don't say they were suppressed or they died, but they went asleep. And now the young people who are learning the language are bringing it back alive, and we're only teaching it among ourselves, that we want to learn the language first, because we have all these other outsiders, especially many linguists. Oh, I want to learn the language. And we're going, no, 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 it's ours. We want to learn it first. We want to converse in it first. And the same thing with the spirituality. We want to understand the traditional spirituality of our ancestors, bring it into our world today. And then once we understand it, once we are practicing it, then we will feel welcome to share it with you. But until that time, yes, it becomes very offensive when people want, well, I want to learn your religious tradition. And in many cases, some of the Native people that are approached by the sincerely interested, they put them off because they don't even know the religion themselves. So often, you know, sometimes when you don't know the answer or you don't know the subject matter, if you're in a position of authority, your answer is no. And it's not no because I don't want you to do this, it's no because I don't know how to tell you about it. And so in our community, there's a revitalization going on with all the cultural aspects, with the spiritual aspects, and we're trying to learn them ourselves first before we share them. And so therefore it becomes very difficult when people come up and say, I want to understand your religion. How do you say, I'm not even sure I understand it yet, but I'm trying to connect to it. And then when you get to our politically correct society today, and there are some religious groups that have the same restrictions, but say in the Roundhouse, which was the house of prayer, the women were not allowed in. The dances happened inside. But of course, when we go to the oral tradition, and I remember as a boy talking to my grandmother who was born in 1890, and she remembers the dances at the Roundhouse, and she would say, yes, the women couldn't go in during the dance, but when the dance was over, guess who had to go in and clean it? Just like with the temple in Jerusalem, right? Only the high priest could go into the temple, but the janitor was allowed to go in and clean it. And so there are some moments and exceptions when you go, that's practical. But it's hard to say that since they could go in to clean, that they would be welcome during the ceremony.
Thank you. Yeah. I think, you know, building on, you know, these different things, the cultural appropriation, you know, brings up the issue of, as you were just saying, Andy and Ruben, both the sort of transmission of the ideas and the way that they take shape in different contexts and influence different contexts, or maybe fail to influence different contexts. And, you know, I'm thinking in the case of Buddhism, some of the things I've been teaching about recently, thinking about are, you know, what happens when sort of Cartesian, you know, I think therefore I am individualism meets Buddhism. Well, often in the West, it becomes, as you've written yourself, Ruben, and Alan Sponberg and others have, a sort of individualized quest for mindfulness, which is actually contrary to everything the Buddhist worldview is about. So it may be helpful, but it's not really Buddhism. And so to connect that idea of, how these things take shape when they enter context with one of the questions from our participants. We got a great question from Professor Andrew Keener from our English department about, ways that the religious traditions that you deal with addresses money and accumulation and wealth, in relationship to our knowledge of the ecological crisis. And here we might name, patterns of consumption, consumerism in particular. How do you, what are the intersections there, and how do you feel that it's best to talk about that with young people today? I'll throw that out to the panel.
This is a tough one, and I'd like to invite my co-panelists to first address it. I may have some thoughts later, but I'd like to hear how you would address that.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe answer the second half first of how do you feel it's best to talk about these kinds of things with young people. What I'm noticing, especially with my students, is this sort of openness and willingness among young people today to confront some of these really, really complicated issues. I know from, my own youth that people were happy to talk about them, but then that shift from talking to then taking action seemed to not always transpire. And I think we're seeing action much more these days because perhaps the problems we're facing are so urgent, they demand our immediate attention. But we're seeing this sort of participation of younger people in these conversations and protests and marches in such great numbers that it makes me think that it's not just that we need to talk to them about these issues, they need to talk to us, right? Because they're the inheritors of all of the problems. We are the inheritors. And so I think that it's a conversation that is necessary and urgent, but it's already happening. But the way you're phrasing this, Andrew, of also thinking about money and accumulation in relation to the environment, so not just the amassing of wealth, but how does it affect the environment, is something that still needs to be, the contours of that conversation need to be articulated. So just a few weeks ago, I was watching this documentary about how internet use affects the environment. And I thought, oh, that's kind of weird. I never really thought about that. But the article that the documentary was citing, and they were talking to the author of this article, was saying that these massive wind turbines need to be used to power the computers that run the clouds, that we put all of our information and store it all in. And the amount of electricity needed to generate all that power is immense. Now, most of us aren't thinking about that when we scroll through Instagram or Facebook or check something on Google. And every act that we're engaged in is impacting the environment, right? And so that quest to accumulate the latest technology, the latest sort of gadget that will help us gain knowledge faster, is also somehow impacting and diminishing the environment. And so I think that young people are willing and ready to talk about them, to talk about these issues, but we are all still figuring out the ways in which these conversations are implicated. Where do they need to happen? And how do we do it? So that would be a very preliminary answer.
If I may take
Ruben?
a stab at that, from a Buddhist perspective, the very roots of our current malaise, of our human condition being dislocated, causing suffering for myself and for everybody, is found in the so-called three poisons: greed, ill will, and delusion. And to make a long story short, focusing on greed, this tendency in human beings, because of our insecurity of my little self vis-a-vis a bigger world out there, which I feel is separate from me. I want more and more and more and more to bolster myself. And in seeing that, we realize that the way to overturn and subvert that creed is to realize that I am one with all. And so that rather than accumulating and getting and wanting, I am invited to live a lifestyle of giving and a way that shares myself as a gift to the world. So that transformation from greed to generosity. Now, if we look at our social system that runs the global economic system that we're all influenced by, it's run precisely on the greed of consumeristic capitalism, capitalistic consumerism. Now, I'm not advocating a socialistic or a communistic way here, but again, as one of the participants just noted, Pope Francis is calling for an ecological, or rather a new economic revolution. And that's, he puts up the page in the chat there. And so we need an economic revolution that will change our system from one that is based on greed and accumulation and wanting more and more and more, to one that is truly respectful and reverential and acknowledging the holy in all of us in a way that we can all live together and participate in the fruits of the earth. That's a major task for all of us, really. So we need to really be aware that each one of us can contribute to this major task, and we can't just let things continue in the way we've been doing things.
That's excellent. Thank you. And I think, as we're coming nearer to a close here, and you've just started, both of you, Ruben and Kathleen, to respond to one of the other questions, which is about this, from David Dawson, this constant stream of, sort of consumerist input that's, coming to us from social media. As one of my students just, talked about how Instagram recently in a paper, Instagram is this sort of like narcissist's paradise, because you can constantly be doing. But what that does, when you think about not just sort of what it is, but what it does, how it changes how we think about ourselves, think about our world, the purpose of our actions, why we do what we do. It is setting up a certain, individualist and consumerist focus that it, as David observes, might be very difficult for religion to compete with. And yet there are these powerful resources within these traditions for engaging that. So, thinking of this move toward action, which all of you, of our panelists have addressed in various ways, I wanted us to maybe close on a question that each one can answer in turn, as they're able. And it comes from one of our religious studies and environmental studies double majors, Will Gagan, who's a great student and member of our community. And he asks this, in light of this, we do this thing where we get together in an academic context and we have these, fancy highfalutin conversations. But, what are the best ways to continue a valuable, exigent, interreligious conversation like this one outside the academic sphere? How do we take it to the streets? Where do we go from here? And so maybe I invite each one of you just very briefly to offer one thought in response to that question. How do we take this beyond this event today?
Well, if I may start, one thought: talk to your family, your spouse. And well, Kathleen and Daniel are lucky that you're already talking to one another in the same panel. But to the circles of influence that we have, if we can continue this conversation in these little circles, it'll be just like a candle lighting other candles, and pretty soon the whole room may be lit with the candles that we all light together.
Yeah, if I can go next, I think I would second what Ruben just said and say that never underestimate the power of your individual voice. That I think one of the things that this last year has shown us across the world is the power of the collective when individuals stand up for what they believe is right? So when you ask, how can we take this out from here into the public sphere, into the streets, as Paul said, the answer is to use your voice in the best way you know how. So maybe this is an act as simple as calling your local state officials and demanding a better recycling program, right? Maybe it's looking at how you're using water in your house. It's something very simple. Can you use a little bit less water today? And all of these little acts, they do add up. They have such collective impact, but it requires that first step. And I think this gets to Sarah's question too. How can we bring these beliefs, these conversations to public policy? Get involved in local politics. Call up your senators, call up your prime ministers, your presidents. You can leave messages, voicemail for all of them. And they are obligated as public servants to respond. And so take advantage of that. If you have a thought, share it with them. Don't be afraid. That would be my advice.
If I may dovetail on what Kathleen had just said, yes, individually, but then collectively. An example, when many anthropologists or environmentalists will often say, well, let's be like the Indians. Okay, that's when they call us Indians. Let's be like the Indians. And whenever they would pick the harvest, they would leave an offering for the earth, okay? Or whenever they would go fishing, they would, bless the water that provided the fish, et cetera, et cetera. But now we're starting to talk about why were the villages only 50 to 75 people, and they weren't these large, complex with 300-400. Well, some of them in the San Francisco East Bay where the weather was good, there were those large villages. And the reason is when a village got to a site of a population of 50, 70 people, they started to over-harvest the area. So it was time to tell the young people, move away, go start your village over there because you're over-harvesting the resources that are right here to support this 50 to 70 people. If somehow we could take it to the streets, that yes, we need to do the individual actions, so that way we can continue to stand together, but not overcrowd each other. There'll be a way somebody's going to come up with a fancy term to describe that. But I think it's very important that we realize that the community has to realize that we are over harvesting the environment. And what can we do so that we don't over harvest one particular area, but that we spread out like people who lived as hunters and gatherers? Because otherwise there's not going to be enough animals to eat or enough acorns to gather if you've got too many people concentrated in one area.
If I may just say one thing before we close. The internet is a very powerful tool for sharing. So Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, share videos. And if I may, the videos of David Attenborough are very powerful. For those of you who have not yet seen any of his, those can really move you to really see the beauty of the earth and to feel the pain of its being ravaged right now. That's one way of beginning to spread this conversation. Share videos. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Yes, thank you, Ruben. Thank you all so much for your contributions for this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful discussion. The individual and the collective coming together and working for action, I think, is such a great call. And finding ways to live small even when our world is big. I think, Andy, you started to gesture in that direction, and Kathleen, all of us did. Is such a great message to take forward and to spread that gospel, so to speak, as we go forth from this. So I'm going to turn it over finally to Aaron for just a real quick closeout. And I just want to thank you all again, to our panelists and to all our participants, for being here tonight.
Yeah, just quickly to thank Paul and Kathleen and Ruben and Andy and Daniel for taking part in this evening and being part of this important conversation. And again, I hope we do take it out beyond this event, and that we have opportunities to kind of live into these possibilities and to take action. So on that, thank you. I just also want to talk about our next event very briefly. Next Tuesday, Just Universities Practicing Solidarity in Difficult Times, exploring this kind of tension between the values and mission of a Jesuit Catholic institution in the context of kind of corporatization of higher education. So I think it'll be a wonderful conversation that kind of can build on some of the things around justice and community and dialogue that we've started here tonight. And so again, thank you to our panelists for being here. It was a wonderful conversation. And thank you all who attended and were here with us tonight. So have a great evening.